Good evening, everybody. Let me start by saying I think this is my personal opinion, that Singapore lies at the cusp of perhaps its greatest policy and economic challenges since independence going forward. There's several reasons for this. You can see many of them in the news yourselves. First, there's the fracture of the global economy happening before our eyes between the Chinese bloc, the US bloc, and the uncertain and worried bloc in between, right? And this fracture may extend not just to trade, but to capital, to maybe even to people and finance. We'll have to see how that plays out. This can't be good. It needs to be navigated. Secondly, there's the huge tsunami of technology whose effects we are still uncertain about. Only thing we know, they will be completely far-reaching, right? So there is artificial intelligence. It will replace about 40% of the jobs in the next 20 years, which is pretty soon. It's the horizon that we are talking about. And this is combined with the Internet of Things that will completely reconfigure global manufacturing. It's combined with 3G printing, which will change the comparative advantage of who produces what, where, and global supply and manufacturing chains. And in all this confusion, in all this uncertainty, in this VUCA world, Singapore will have to re-navigate, reimagine, reinvent the policies that, while successful in the past, will almost uncertainly not be successful in the future. Let me just recap, therefore, from our views at the first FOSG meeting. What are the three key weaknesses, strategic weaknesses and gaps and deficits in the way the Singapore economy is currently structured and economic policy is currently managed? And then I'll briefly touch on what are the essential elements we need to see to cover these deficits before we know that we are perhaps on the right track again. And finally, after elaborating on that, I'm going to then turn the floor over to the rest of the speakers, in particular, Mr. Inderjit Singh, who has written, in my opinion, an extremely good piece on how we need to revitalize manufacturing, and many of the arguments that apply to economic policy as a whole. So let me dive in, as Kevin has says, expand a little more. The three main deficits. The first, as we mentioned in the last FOSG, is the obvious decline in international competitiveness that we see and experience and we observe in Singapore, related to two main phenomena. The first being an uncertainty that we see in Singapore, not just decline, actual decline, but uncertainty. We see first from an excessive reliance on foreign direct investment, foreign direct capital, and foreign capital to drive our international competitiveness, and the hollowing out and the weakness of our domestic entrepreneurs, particularly the SMEs that accompany this. This is one salient feature that we do not share with the other successful economies like Germany, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, you name it, those economies that are much more well-positioned to navigate the next 30 years. But this is a huge deficit on our part. The second is of equal size to our manufacturing sector and can be thought of as the big second globally competitive engine is our GLC sector, which unfortunately is to all appearances, secular decline. Many of the industries that we were once strong in, shipbuilding, rig building, are beginning to falter. Others have already faltered and been sold off, like shipping. SIA is having its position questioned, etc., etc. And if you go down the list of all the GLCs, you'll see 80%, if you look at the stock prices of the last 10 years, are not in just cyclical, but seem to be in secular decline. The other thing about the other key deficit is an excess reliance on foreign labor. This is obvious, right? We have so much reliance on foreign labor, it's depressed our wages, it's depressed our productivity, and it threatens to, if we continue on this road, not enable us to get to the high value added, the better high productive jobs and boost up the productivity of the whole economy that we so desperately need. The third is an insufficient integration into our regional hinterland, which is ASEAN. Now, this is not a small deficit because Aside from China, aside from India, the third biggest Asia-Pacific bloc, 500 million now going to 750 million in 20 years' time, is ASEAN. It is also, by the way, thanks to our great diplomatic efforts over the last 40 years, an effective free trade area. This effective free trade area is essentially, therefore, an economic bloc similar to India and China potentially, and can therefore be used to A, shelter, and B, navigate us way through this fracturing of the global economy between China and the US and the nervous rest. Okay, so let me elaborate a little more and then go on to what we need to do. Elaborate a little more in the sense that if we look at the MNC sector, why are we worried about it? Foreign capital, MNC sector, huge big engine of the economy, is essentially now footloose and increasingly fickle. Not only are they footloose because of good economic reasons, the reasons for the rationale for competitiveness of the current configuration of supply chains is completely being changed as we speak. But secondly, if you look at the corporate culture, it is increasingly, a lot of them are with what I would call stakeholder-oriented US, UK type crowd who have no loyalties to anybody, maybe not even their shareholders except their management, right? And so if they're willing to sacrifice their own employees on the altar of the next 2 quarters profit, will they not, what loyalty will they have to the country of their current domicile, right? This is in contrast to the other economies I mentioned, for example, Taiwan, Korea, Japan, and Germany, whose follow a more stakeholder-oriented corporate culture, whose actually first loyalty besides to their customers is to their staff and the communities, who are therefore what we call better rooted and will do everything they can to preserve the welfare of their staff, the clients, and the communities. And so we are too heavily dependent on this foreign fickle sector, and our domestic sector, which could perhaps be more stakeholder-oriented, has been hollowed out. We go on to the GLC sector, right? The GLC sector, I have mentioned, is in serial decline, but more important than that, it too is shifting towards, in my humble opinion, a shareholder-oriented culture from what used to be a more stakeholder-oriented culture, just at the time when we need the GLCs to be able to move us into the region, to move the other SMEs into the region and expand them, as the stakeholder economies of Korea and Taiwan and Japan have been doing. Government alone is not enough to push us into the region, into the world. They need to engage the big companies as serious organizational allies. And our current GLCs, unfortunately, to my opinion, are not yet fit for purpose to do this. That's a second serious problem. The problem of excess foreign labor, you all know, for the last 20 years up to 2010, we have depressed wages, let in 1.2 million unskilled and semi-skilled workers, depressed productivity, addicted our SMEs to labor-intensive production, which they're only beginning to crawl out of now very reluctantly, and therefore they are not going to the next level of higher value-added jobs at the rate that we need to survive all these tectonic changes I was talking about. And finally, our links to the region, to ASEAN. While we have participated in ASEAN, we have not been proactive or bold or forward-thinking enough. For example, we did not participate in a bold infrastructure plan led by Singapore to finance infrastructure in the region, even though it was totally affordable. We have been too cautious, too hesitant to really engage with the region, but this we need to do for the reasons I mentioned. It is the only safe harbor we have if the world splits into 2 or 3, right? And from that safe harbor, we can perhaps navigate this tripolar or bipolar world a bit better. Now, I'm going to touch now on the key essential elements that I as an economist would need to see to know that we are back on the right track. Currently, EDB, the way it's run, was excellent in the past, but to me was yesterday's game. It was largely getting foreign direct investment in. But the way it moved, the way it coordinated across ministries, its power, its clout, needs to be replicated in an incoherent industrial policy of the kind they have in Germany, of the kind they have in Taiwan, of the kind they have in Switzerland, at least of the kind they have in Korea, of the kind they have in Japan. It needs to be replicated in an agency like that for the SMEs. And while we did, EDB did a lot of powerful things, usually largely to do with physical infrastructure, to do with fiscal infrastructure and attracting that investment. We need to do new things to do with cost-based infrastructure, bringing the cost of rents down, bringing the cost of utilities down, to do with particularly financial infrastructure. Where are the Exim banks, the credit cooperatives, the banks that know and understand the risk of lending to domestic entrepreneurs, right? The government participation in both equity and loan capital in large enough amounts. I'm not saying that Enterprise Singapore does not do it. They are doing it in the right amounts, but just to give you an idea, in 2019, they gave away about 50 million to 65 startups as equity. That's good, that's great, but it's way too little for the government agency that runs the whole thing. NUS itself is thinking to give this kind of equity capital to 50 organizations. Where is the scaled national effort that needs to accompany this sort of effort? So therefore, and Inderjit will talk about this, part of this best practice industrial policy includes rejuvenating the manufacturing sector. Manufacturing sector is a key sector because it is the locus of productivity growth. It is the locus of multiplier of high value jobs. So it creates nearly 9 to 10 times more high value added jobs per one job you create in manufacturing that's sustainable than, say, the service sector, right? It can really energize and dynamize and this has been on the decline. We were once 28% of GDP in the early 2000s was in manufacturing. Now we're down to 18.5%, right? We should minimally get back to 25%, if not push up towards the 30% we see in all these successful industrial economies. And we have the background to do it. We have the industrial experience in these industries to do it. We once did it. We lost it. We need to regain it, right? Inderjit will talk about how we do these things. The other thing that this agency needs to do now that did not do, has to consider doing, besides coming out with, is providing this, besides coming out with this financial infrastructure that I mentioned, is actually taking stakes, buying over good foreign SMEs that have a future in their industries, that have good managements, that can fit in and therefore energize, and that we can control locally to partner our boys, be they in the private sector or the GLC sector. That's an area, especially now with COVID, with all these companies weak and seeking capital, that we can really explore, and Inderjit will talk a bit more about this, right? So the final thing I want to talk about, the second final thing I want to talk about is Inderjit's argument that one big new frontier that we have before us as we move to the high value added jobs, particularly in manufacturing, but also in other areas, is what he calls prototyping, productization, and commercialization of R&D. We have spent a ton of money on R&D in A-Star, right? Billions and billions, and we've achieved very, I would say, in many cases, spectacular scientific results. But these results have not gone the last mile, have not been supported the last mile commercially, financially, by this financial infrastructure I was talking about, to actually become prototype factories. How do you then productize it, optimize the factory, the technology, and then locate it optimally in the labor-intensive, industrially booming region. And the region will boom not just because it is competitive cost-wise, it will doubly boom because a lot of countries in China trying to escape the US ban will naturally move to Southeast Asia. This will happen like it did in the Endaka of the late, the early 90s, right? So we are missing out on this huge opportunity if we do not first get into this productization. Inderjit has successfully done it, no less in Silicon Valley. He'll tell you a bit about it. And we can do it here, and we can therefore create our supply chains in the region which we have hub control of, or hub benefits from, which are tremendous. And this is the intelligent way to rationalize. And the locus of this, Keng Soon will talk about, perhaps our universities. And finally, I say, what are we going to do with the GLCs, right? We need to seriously think about changing management away from bureaucratic management to entrepreneurial management. We were once successful in doing this. Think Joe Pillay, think Sin Ki Bun, think Ang Kong Hua, think many of these people who created huge value. Where has that value gone? Okay, can we do it again in this new environment with a new set of entrepreneurs? This is